last couple of months, we've been exploring Sangharakshita's formulation of the 5 aspects of the spiritual path, also known as the 5 great stages of the spiritual path, and various other names as well it's acquired along the way. And as you can see from the flip chart, those 5 aspects of the spiritual path are integration, positive emotion, spiritual death, spiritual rebirth, and receptivity. And I imagine if we keep saying them often enough, we'll all probably remember them. So far this year, we've been looking at the first of those two, integration and positive emotion. So integration, it means something like making one, an integer as a whole number, making whole. So to follow the spiritual path, we need to become a whole person. We need to become a unified individual. And we've seen we don't necessarily, we don't start life as a unified individual, a unified being. We start out on the path usually with lots of conflicting desires and goals, conflicting parts of ourselves even. It's described as though we're a bundle of people tied together with a name. According to our moods, one day we're one thing, one day we're the next. One day one thing seems really important, the next day that doesn't seem so important at all. Or maybe we're different when we're with different groups of people. There are different selves that come to the fore. And we usually don't know ourselves very well. We don't start out life knowing ourselves very well. We have this idea of ourselves, which is usually very idealised, but it's usually not very realistic. We usually think of ourselves as thoroughly nice, decent chaps and chapesses, decent folk. Turning a blind eye to our anger and our competitiveness and our aggression and our envy and our craving, and maybe our resentment. We're just not aware of a lot of the things that are driving us, actually. We have this image of ourselves as being really quite nice. When underneath there's this sort of beast going, give me more of that, get out of my way, etc., etc. So we're not aware. Well, I'm speaking personally. We're not aware of a lot of the things that drive us, actually. So that because we're not aware of them, they can rule us from the shadows. We find people see us acting in ways that are clearly competitive, clearly aggressive, clearly whatever, but we're fine, They can rule us from the shadows. And it means we can't use the energy that's tied up in them. And there's an awful lot of energy tied up in these perhaps less nice parts of ourselves that we just don't want to acknowledge. So they can't serve our higher purposes, as it were. So we need to become aware of the whole of ourselves and harness the energy of the whole of ourselves. And we need to do that with, as it were, these lower parts of ourselves, but also we need to become aware of our heights. We need to become aware of our higher potentials, our higher emotions. Sometimes we need to discover those and bring them into our lives, integrate them in our lives. So all of that is summed up in this first stage, this first great aspect, integration. We need to integrate ourselves, we need to become whole. And the mindfulness of breathing is one really helpful tool in doing this, because it allows us to get to know our own mind. And it has this ability to bring our mind together. We sort of focus our mind, we unify our mind, has a unifying gathering quality on the different strands of our being, bringing them together and uniting them. And the practice of ethics is also very, very useful as a sort of integrating tool. So we need to become an individual, integration. But it's possible to be an individual and to be completely disconnected from others and trapped in our individuality, trapped in the prison of our limited self. So we need more than that. We need to become an emotionally healthy individual, an individual whose emotions connect them to other beings and the world around us. So we need positive emotion. We need to cultivate those emotions that connect us, like metta, compassion, joy in others, gratitude, reverence for what's higher than ourselves, reverence for beauty. And we need to actively work at all of that. That's not going to happen just by chance. We need to actively work at that. Our emotional life is a bit like a garden. We can actively cultivate and encourage the beautiful flowers and the shrubs and the beautiful trees, and actively discourage the ugly weeds and the bare patches. There can be a tendency in our society, I think, to think that we don't have any choice about our emotions, that somehow we just are like this, we feel like this, and to feel anything else would be inauthentic. But our emotions are a conditioned phenomenon, and we can change them, we can cultivate them. And the way we think and speak and act all has a tremendous impact on our emotions. So we can cultivate the garden of our emotions. In fact, we need to. So that it becomes less of a wasteland and more of a paradisical garden, and connects us more and more to other beings. So those are the first two stages, the first two aspects of the spiritual life that we've been looking at so far. Becoming an individual, and then becoming a connected individual. And tonight we're going to move on and start looking at spiritual death and spiritual rebirth. And I've sort of recast this a little bit as we need to become an individual. I don't suppose you can read this. Become a connected individual. Then let go of being a limited individual, spiritual death, and become more than an individual, spiritual rebirth. So it's that letting go of being a limited individual and becoming more than just an individual that we're looking at tonight. We're starting to look at tonight, and we'll be looking at for several weeks. So tonight I'm going to begin by that exploration by illustrating it with a very famous story from the Buddha's time told in the Pali Canon. But before I do that, I think I just need to say a little bit more about what we're talking about when we talk about spiritual death and rebirth, because I'm not sure it's completely clear necessarily to everybody. And first of all, I'd like to draw a distinction between what I might call small spiritual deaths and rebirths and the big one. Okay. So small spiritual deaths, rebirth. If we're going to be growing as people, growing as beings, we need to have many small deaths and rebirths. We need to keep leaving behind old versions of ourselves and stepping into new, bigger versions of ourselves. We need to keep transcending the person we've been to become the person we could become. And each time we do that, that involves a small spiritual death and a small spiritual rebirth. The two go together. They're just two sides of the same coin, spiritual death and spiritual rebirth. And this sort of spiritual death and rebirth needs to be part of our practice from the very beginning. It needs to be there from the very beginning of our practice. You can see it in all sorts of ways. I mean, if we decide to take on a practice of ethics where we're going to be honest, then the person who used to spin the truth for their own advantage has to die, and a new, more person with more integrity has to emerge. In all sorts of ways, we need to be having a little spiritual deaths, leaving part of ourselves behind, leaving an old version of ourselves behind, stepping into a new, bigger version of ourselves. But then there's the big one. So there's small spiritual deaths, then there's the big one. The big spiritual death and the big spiritual rebirth. So many Buddhists see the big spiritual death as insight into the lakshana of anatman, non-self. That's how it's often put, insight into non-self, which again many people interpret as seeing that we don't have a self, or even as destroying the ego, destroying the self. But actually this is based on a bit of a misreading of Anatman. It's based on a misinterpretation. Anatman does not mean no self. It means no fixed, eternal self that's independent of everything around it. That's what Atman means. We do have a self. We have a self that is more like a fixed flowing stream than like an object, like a stuck object. We have a self that's constantly evolving, constantly changing, and we have a self that is enmeshed with the world around it, deeply interconnected to other people and the world around it. We have a self that exists in relationship. So we have an interconnected and changing self. What we don't have is an independent and fixed self. And it's really easy to misinterpret the idea of an Atman. It very often gets misinterpreted. Sangharakshita warns us about grasping at it. I don't have a self, we don't have a self. Grasping at that because we don't like ourselves. Because we don't like ourselves, for one thing. So we've not yet created a strong, ethical, positive, emotionally positive self. So we don't actually feel that good about ourselves. So we welcome the idea that we don't really have a self to not feel good about it. That can be one wrong approach, if you like, to non-self. He also warns us about using non-self as a way of avoiding responsibility. I don't have a self, so there's no me to be responsible. It's just bare conditions rolling on. That's what did it, not me. I never done it, Gov. And I don't have to take responsibility for my mental states because I'm just this conditioned being. And he also warns us against using it as an excuse for not being wholehearted and energetic in the way we live. So he says we can think that anything we're passionate about is just an expression of ego. So we have to be passionless and lacking in any oomph. And he says, once again, that's a misinterpretation of it. He says the goal of Buddhahood is to go beyond the individual self, not to regress from the achievement of individual selfhood. So I'll say that again. The goal of Buddhism is to go beyond the individual self, not to regress from the achievement of individual selfhood. It actually takes something to achieve genuine individual selfhood. And we're not doing away with that, we're going beyond it. The Buddha was a powerful and very distinct individual. But he was also more than an individual. There was something universal through him, shining through him and acting through him. So that is more like our goal, to be an individual, yet more than an individual. So this big spiritual death we're talking about is about going beyond the individual self, as the Buddha did, not destroying the individual self. In the same way that, the second story of a building goes beyond the first story, and the second floor goes beyond the first floor, but it doesn't do away with the first floor. Or in the way that a tree that suddenly bursts into blossom goes beyond the trunk and the roots, but it doesn't leave the trunk and the roots behind, as it were. They're still part of it. It's much more like that. The non-flowering tree has died. There's been a spiritual death. A new blossoming tree has been born. But it hasn't cut itself down. We sometimes talk about spiritual death as going beyond the ego, but what Sangharakshita says about this is that the ego is just a tendency to see us, the way we are now, as somehow fixed and absolute, to see there's something absolute about what we think of as ourselves, as we are now. This is who I am. That's what the ego is. This is who I am. And he says this is just a faulty interpretation. This is just a faulty interpretation. We can see completely through this false interpretation. It's not true. So we can see completely through it. When we have a big spiritual death, we see that we can be free of all the fetters that keep us stuck in a particular way of being. We can see that we have this infinite potential. We are free. All of those fetters we invented for ourselves. We've escaped from the cage we've made for ourselves, and we're flying off into the blue sky. Freedom. But this is only going to happen if we've built that foundation, if we become a strong, integrated, emotionally healthy person, if we've used small spiritual deaths to grow. Then when we experience the big spiritual death, we can go beyond being just an individual, and we can experience a spiritual rebirth that goes with it. But if we've not become an individual, if we've not become a strong individual, we cannot go beyond being an individual. In fact, what happens is when we meet the spiritual death, we just get shattered, we get broken. Transcendental wisdom destroys the views and the conditionings and the categories that we use to define ourselves. And in someone whose individuality is not well developed, that can just be shattering. It can lead to the disintegration of the working personality, the functional personality. It can cause a breakdown even. We need to do it on the basis of integration and positive emotion. And actually the story of spiritual death that I'm going to tell tonight is not a very good example. Do not do this at home. It's not an example we should copy, because the main character is maybe in some ways not ready for the big spiritual death. The main character does get shattered. But she's lucky enough to meet the Buddha. She's lucky enough to live at the time of the Buddha and to meet the Buddha, and he puts her back together again. So this is the story of Kisa Gotami, actually, that many, many of you will know. So the tradition tells us that Kisa Gotami was a very poor orphan. And her name means something like skinny Gotami. And being skinny, being thin, was not a good thing. In societies, in traditional societies like India, very often thinness is certainly not associated with female beauty particularly, and it is associated with poverty and low status. So poor, low status people are thin. Rich, high status people are not. So being thin was definitely not seen as attractive. Being thin was associated with poverty and low status. And Kisa Gotami's name, Skinny Gotami, was pretty much of an insult, actually. Skinny, ugly, poor Gotami. That sort of thing. That's all implied. But the tradition goes on to tell us that a certain rich man took a liking to Kisa Gotami and arranged for her to marry one of his sons. And this saved her from poverty, obviously. This saved her from poverty. But still, her life among the women of the extended family that she'd married into was not a happy one. Kisa Gotami would not have lived in a nice little nuclear family with a sort of front room, and she was together with her husband. And Kisa Gotami lived in a clan. She lived in an extended family. She was part of an extended family, and she would have spent most of her time among the women of the extended family, of whom there would have been many. And even today in India, new brides, new wives can have quite a hard time sometimes if they don't get on with their mother-in-law, for example. They can be treated as little better than a servant by the mother-in-law and the older women in the extended family. And Kisa Gotami was worse off than worst because she was poor and she was skinny and she was low status, ugly by the standards of the time. People probably thought the son had married beneath himself. So she had no status among the women of the family. She was looked down upon and treated as an unpaid servant. But then something wonderful happened to Gotami. She got pregnant. Immediately her status shot up. Immediately her status shot up. People began to treat her with more respect. She was given more leisure. and better food, and maybe even cosseted a little, looked after a little. Do sit down, you've got to look after yourself. And then after 9 months, she gave birth to a son. And her status shot up even more. In traditional societies, in India and many other traditional societies, sons are really valued. Sons are really valued. Sons bring in the wealth. Sons are maybe even needed for protection. Sons are really valued. And Kisa Gotami was the mother of a son, maybe the heir to the family fortune. Suddenly she was a woman of status within the extended family. As well as having the natural happiness that a woman might feel about having a baby, there was now something else as well for Kisa Gotami. The poor, low-status, skinny girl was now someone who was given respect. Giving birth to a son made Kisa Gotami somebody. She was somebody where she had been a nobody. Her son defined her new status. Her son defined who she was. And all of this was great for Kisa Gotami. And then the absolutely unthinkable happened, and her son sickened and died. As well as the natural grief and sadness that any mother would feel at the death of a baby, there was the extra dimension for Kisa Gotami. The son had made her somebody. The son who made her somebody was dead. She was a nobody again. She was not a somebody. The thing that defined her had disappeared. So she suffered, in fact, the worst sort of spiritual death, the sort of spiritual death that we do not wish to emulate, which is a sort of shattering. She went to pieces. She disintegrated. She refused to accept that her baby was dead. And long after it was obvious to everybody else that the child was dead, she carried it around. She took to roaming about the streets of the city, knocking on doors and accosting strangers, telling them her son was ill and asking, please give me some medicine to cure him. And as far as her family and her neighbours were concerned, well, Kisa Gotami had gone mad. And then in her wanderings about the city, she saw an old man who seemed to have an air of wisdom about him. So she went up to him saying, are you a doctor? Are you a doctor? My baby is ill, my son is ill, can you cure him? And the old man saw that the baby was dead. He saw that the baby was dead, and that Kisa Gotami desperately needed some sort of help. So he said to her, I'm really sorry, I cannot cure your son. But I know somebody who can. That man is called the Buddha, and at the moment he is staying in a grove on the outskirts of town. So with a company of his followers. So if you head off in that direction over there, reach the edge of the city, ask for his whereabouts, you will be directed to the Buddha. He will be able to cure your son. So Kisa Gotami went with her dead son in her arms and found the Buddha. And she said, can you, my son is ill, can you cure my son? Can you please cure my son? I've been told you can cure my son. And the Buddha, of course, saw that the baby was dead. But what he said was, yes, I can cure your son. I can cure your son. I can make a medicine that will cure your baby. But for me to do that, you just need to get me a small pinch of mustard seeds. You just need to get me a small pinch of mustard seeds. So go back into the city and go to the first house you come to and ask, can you have a small pinch of mustard seed? And so Kisa goes, yes, of course, I'm off. So she's just about off, and the Buddha said, oh, just one more thing, though. Just one more thing, go to me. Just one more thing. This pinch of mustard seeds, it needs to come from a house where nobody has lost a child, or a husband, or a wife, or a mother, or a father, or a friend. That's the only condition. But just get me some mustard seed. So thinking nothing about that, Kisa Gotami rushes off back to the city. And the first house she saw, she knocks on the door and asks if she could have just a little pinch of mustard seed. because the Buddha had told her that this would cure her baby. And mustard seed is widely used in Indian cooking now. I think it probably used to be used more before they discovered chilies, because they didn't have chilies, before they discovered America. So every family had mustard seed. And the woman who answered the door said, well, of course, love, of course. And she went off to the kitchen to get a pinch of mustard seed for this strange woman at the door. And Kisa Gotami took the seed. She took the seed. She said, thank you very much. She was about to go, and she said, but just one thing. The mustard seed has to come from a house where nobody has lost a child, or a husband, or a wife, or a father, or a mother, or a friend. Is that okay? So the woman said, I'm really sorry, but I lost my husband only last year. If that's what you need, I'm sorry, I can't help you. So Kisa, off she goes to another house. And then another house, and another house, and another house. And of course the same thing happened at every single one. Every house had mustard seed. But at every house, the person who answered the door said something like, well, I'm sorry, I myself have lost 2 children. Or, well, my mother died just a few months ago. Or, well, I'm still mourning for my wife. Or, well, both of my parents are dead and I'm a widow. And this happened at every house, house after house after house after house. On and on. At every house, at least one beloved had died. And often many, many more than one. On and on, house after house, until it was nearly getting dark. Night was coming on. And at the last house that Kisa Gotami visited, the woman who answered the door said, alas, the living are few, but the dead are many. Do not remind us of our grief. And something really hit home with Kisa Gotami. She sat down, tired and footsore and discouraged, and looked down on the lights of the city. But as the darkness came on, she came to her senses. And we can assume she had a form of insight experience. We are told that she thought, how selfish have I been in my grief? Death is common to all. So she went into the forest and she buried her baby. And then she went back to the Buddha, went for refuge to him, and asked to become a nun, a female renunciant. And we are told that she later became enlightened herself. I believe there's some poems that she wrote, which are in the collection of the Terigata. The collection of the poems of the nuns, and there's some poems by her in that. So this story, I think, is a really good example of the Buddha's genius as a teacher. He didn't tell her, so this woman turns up with a dead baby, clearly, out of touch with reality. He didn't say, face reality, love, He didn't give her a lecture about impermanence. All conditioned things pass. He found a way to transform her suffering. He transformed it, first of all, into an insight into the universal fact of impermanence and death. And he found a way to transform her suffering from something that cut her off from other people into something that connected her to other people, because she realized that they too shared her suffering and her grief. So he, at one and the same time, he used her suffering to transform it into both wisdom and compassion. And it was something that connected her to others. So Kisa Gotami suffered a sort of spiritual death, the sort we don't want. Okay? The props that supported herself were kicked away. Basically, her son was just a huge part of the props that supported her sense of self. And that was kicked away. It was quite a brutal blow from reality. And she went to pieces. She was forced to let go of herself. She was forced to let go of her idea of herself as an individual. And on her own, she couldn't use that experience. She couldn't use that experience to catalyze a spiritual rebirth. She just didn't seem to have that basis of integration and positive emotion. But the Buddha very cleverly did this for her. And maybe one day, maybe we could say that the Buddha put in place the integration and the positive emotion that Kisa Gotami seemed to lack, especially the positive emotion, because he gave her this strong sense of compassion and solidarity with others. So he transformed what could have been a shattering experience into a source of liberation. So as I said earlier, maybe Kisa Gotami is not, well, definitely Kisa Gotami is not a good example to choose for our first talk on spiritual death and rebirth, because she's not an example that we want to imitate. She's not an example that we want to go, we do not wish to encourage you all to go out there and shatter yourselves by completely shattering encounters with reality. As Sangharakshita tells us, we need to build a strong, healthy, integrated self based on positive emotion before we seek any sort of big spiritual death, any big encounter with the shattering nature of reality. We need to become an individual. We need to become a connected individual. And only then do we need to go beyond, let go of what keeps us being a limited individual. But then we need to soften the things that define us. Let go of being just an individual. Because without that basis, spiritual death is just a falling apart. It's just a disintegration. And this seems to have been what happened to Kisa Gotami. She seems not to have been that strong an individual, which is not surprising given her background. She needed that prop of her status as a mother of a son. And she couldn't withstand the death, the blow dealt by the death of her baby. But she was lucky, she met the Buddha. And the Buddha turned that spiritual death into a spiritual rebirth. But we are not so lucky. We are not likely to meet the Buddha. And if we experience that sort of big, shattering spiritual death when we're not ready for it, there may be nobody to put us back together again. We may not be able to put ourselves back together. So we need to integrate ourselves. We need to integrate ourselves to become strong individuals with a healthy emotional response to the world and other people, with a healthy self-esteem based on living an ethical, meaningful life. So we need to create that firm foundation before we can safely expose ourselves to the big spiritual death of an encounter with reality, a face-to-face, gloves-off encounter with reality. So yeah, if we practice in that way, then spiritual death will lead to spiritual rebirth. We become a self, and then we go beyond that self. We cease to be a limited individual, but we're still ourselves. We're still an individual, but we exist in a larger, more universal context, freed from the limitations of being a fixed self that's defined by the past. So we could say that what happens is something like we become an awareness that no longer identifies with just one person and his or her concerns. We sort of let go of that awareness so that we expand our boundaries, so that we have a sense, we are in a sense the awareness of the universe, but expressed through the personality of one individual. We become something universal, expressing itself in space and time, as the Buddha was. So, okay, we need that strong basis of integration and positive emotion. Does that mean that this whole idea of spiritual death is irrelevant to us, and we should stop having these talks at that point and just all go away and do something different? Well, no, actually. I think the answer is no. Because what I've been referring to here, what happened to Kisa Gotami, is what I called a big spiritual death. But we also have these little spiritual deaths, and we need those little spiritual deaths all along the way that lead up to the big spiritual death. And we need those to accompany our practice of integration and positive emotion. So right from the beginning of our practice, we need to be working to loosen the ties that keep us stuck within a fixed idea of ourselves. We can do that in all sorts of ways. We need to push back the boundaries of who and what we can be. Step out of our comfort zone. It's as though, there's a story about training elephants, which I love to tell because I've told it loads of times, where apparently they used to train elephants by, they'd take a baby elephant and they'd put a stake in the ground and they'd tie this baby elephant to the stake with a noose around its neck. And when it was a little elephant, it could go anywhere within the radius of the rope. So the little elephant would bound around, but every time it got to the edge, it would go, and pretty soon, when it got near the edge, it would think, oh, I'm not going there. So when it came a big elephant, they could take the rope off, and the elephant would never go out of the circle. Which is a good thing too, because you couldn't stop an elephant if it decided to go out of the circle. And we are like that. We are a bit like that. We have a comfort zone that we operate in. And when we get towards the edge of that comfort zone, we start to feel, ooh, not sure about this, I don't like this. Anxiety, ooh, nervousness, no, I don't want to do this. So we back off. So we live within that comfort zone. And we need those spiritual deaths to just say, over the comfort zone. Just do something different. Do something that makes us feel uncomfortable. Push back the boundaries of our being. So we need to push back the boundaries of our being. That's one of the things we need to do. We need to do all sorts of other things that just encourage this small spiritual death, small spiritual rebirths. Leaving behind the views and opinions that we use to define ourselves. Leaving behind, freeing ourselves from identifications with particular groups of people that we identify with and all their opinions that we have to sort of go along with. I mean, all sorts of groups in society, I hesitate to say it, but probably in tree right now. Guardian readers. We do not have to agree with the Guardian newspaper. Or all the sort of trendy ideas which you just got to, fashionable ideas that just define us as we're this sort of person. We could think for ourselves, free ourselves from those definitions of ourselves as being part of a particular group, part of a fashionable ideology. We could change our style. I decided to wear black for the evening. I wore black for ages. We could just do different things. Just do things differently. Our life just becomes these cycles. We just do things differently. We need to practice these small spiritual deaths, small spiritual rebirths. Intentionally getting out of our comfort zone, intentionally moving beyond the boundaries that we've created for ourselves. So we could sum all that up by, we can go beyond that. We can become concerned with things that are bigger than our own wants and our own anxieties, our own likes and dislikes, our feelings. We can actually see that our likes and our dislikes and our feelings are not that important in the greater scheme of things. We could even serve something higher and more important than they. We could see ourselves in a larger context. We could even serve something larger than our own wants and likes and dislikes. So we could sum all that up by saying that we can leave behind the things that trap us in a small person so that we can become a bigger person. We can go through many small deaths and rebirths. That's part of our growing. That's the way we grow. They're part of the process of becoming a bigger and more developed person, is leaving behind the old, more restricted selves. And these small spiritual deaths and rebirths, they pave the way for that big spiritual death and rebirth that is described in the tradition as a turning about in the deepest seat of consciousness. When we cease to be a limited individual and become something universal, acting through the individual limited in space and time.